Marcus stayed quiet, watching. He wasn't about to do anything that would give them an excuse. He had the patience of a man who had seen too much, who had lived through worse. But he wasn't just going to let this go. And neither was someone else, because what happened next, no one saw coming. The younger officer turned back to Marcus, his expression shifting between understanding and unease. He knew what was happening wasn't right, but there was hesitation in his stance, like he wasn't sure how much he should challenge his colleague. Marcus had seen this dynamic before. One officer taking the lead, the other unsure whether to step in. It was a dangerous balance. One wrong move, one unchecked ego, and things could spiral. The first officer, still gripping Marcus's ID, was clearly not ready to back down. His pride wouldn't let him. He'd gone too far already, and now he was stuck between admitting his mistake or doubling down. Marcus knew how this worked. He'd led teams under pressure, dealt with egos in high-stakes situations. The key wasn't reacting, it was controlling the moment. "Officer," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm but authoritative. "You've had my identification for several minutes now. You know exactly who I am. I'd like to understand why I'm still standing here." The officer's jaw tensed. He shifted on his feet, looking toward his partner, as if searching for backup. But the younger cop hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Then, from the growing crowd, a voice cut through the tension. "Is everything okay here?" A woman stepped forward. She was in civilian clothes, but there was something about her presence, strong, direct, that made both officers take notice. She wasn't just another bystander. Marcus recognized her immediately. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Hayes, one of the best officers he'd ever served with, and by the look on her face, she wasn't about to let this slide. The first officer's posture stiffened. "Ma'am, this is a traffic stop. Please step back." Rachel didn't move. She glanced at Marcus, then at the younger officer. "A traffic stop, because from here, it looks like you're detaining a decorated Navy captain without cause." More people in the crowd murmured. Phones were still recording. The air felt heavier by the second. The first officer's eyes darted around, realizing how many people were watching. His grip tightened on Marcus's ID. He fit the description of a suspect in the area. Rachel folded her arms. "And what description is that exactly?" Silence. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. He could see where this was going. His gaze flicked to his partner, then to the growing number of witnesses. His face showed what his words didn't. This wasn't going to end well for them. Marcus stayed quiet, letting Rachel do what she did best, apply pressure in all the right places. He had nothing to prove here. His record, his rank, his entire career spoke for itself. But now, the real question was, how far was this officer willing to go to save face? And the answer to that was going to change everything. The street was dead silent now, except for the hum of passing cars and the quiet beeping of the police radio. The first officer still hadn't let go of Marcus's ID. His fingers curled around it like he was holding on to the last shred of control he had. But his face told a different story. He was trapped, and he knew it. Rachel took a step closer. Not aggressive, not threatening, but commanding. "Officer," she said, her voice sharp but even, "you need to make a decision. Right now." The younger officer swallowed hard. His eyes darted between Rachel and his partner, then back to the crowd. People were still filming. The weight of the moment was pressing down on all of them. This wasn't just some routine stop anymore. It had turned into something much bigger. Marcus stayed still, every muscle in his body tense. His years in the Navy had taught him patience, but right now, all he could think about was how quickly situations like this could take a turn. He had seen it happen to men who looked like him, good men, innocent men, who didn't get the chance to walk away. The first officer cleared his throat. His grip on Marcus's ID tightened, but his voice wasn't as firm as before. "This is police business. I suggest you stand down." Rachel raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "And I suggest you check your badge number, because I guarantee someone higher up is going to want an explanation for this." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed the officer's face. He knew she was right. A siren wailed in the distance. Another patrol car. Backup. The officer squared his shoulders, like reinforcements would somehow put him back in control. But as the vehicle approached, Marcus noticed something. The car wasn't just any patrol unit, it had a different marking. Higher rank. The door swung open, and out stepped a commanding officer. An older man with silver at his temples and a no-nonsense expression. He scanned the scene in an instant. The tension in the crowd, Marcus standing tall but restrained, Rachel locked in a stare with the officer holding Marcus's ID. His gaze landed on Marcus, then on Rachel. Something clicked. Recognition. "Captain Williams?" His voice carried authority, but this time, it wasn't the same kind Marcus had been dealing with all night. This was someone who knew exactly who he was talking to. Marcus nodded, his voice steady. "That's right." The older officer turned to the first cop. "What's going on here?" Silence. Rachel didn't wait. "Your officer pulled over a decorated Navy captain, detained him without cause, and has refused to explain why." The commanding officer's jaw tightened. He looked at the first officer, waiting for an answer. Marcus could see it now, the shift happening right in front of him. The unraveling of everything this officer had been trying to hold together. But what happened next? No one could have predicted. The first officer stood frozen, his grip still tight around Marcus's ID. His face was pale now, his confidence cracking under the weight of the situation. He had been so sure of his authority, so sure he could control how this played out. But now, with his commanding officer standing in front of him, with the crowd still filming, with Rachel refusing to back down, he had nowhere left to go. The older officer's eyes didn't move from him. "I asked you a question," he repeated, his voice sharp. "What's going on here?" The first officer hesitated. Then, as if clinging to the last bit of power he had, he straightened his posture. Captain or not, he fit the description of a suspect in the area. A beat of silence. Then the commanding officer turned to Marcus. "What's your side of this, Captain?" Marcus exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. "I was driving home when I was pulled over without explanation. I cooperated fully. I gave my identification immediately. I asked for a reason and I got nothing. Instead, I was pulled out of my car, patted down, and humiliated in front of a crowd." His voice didn't waver, but there was weight behind his words. "And now I'm still standing here, waiting for a reason why." The commanding officer's expression hardened. His gaze flicked back to the first officer, who suddenly looked very small. "Give him back his ID." The officer hesitated. His fingers twitched, like he didn't want to let it go. But then slowly he extended his hand, and Marcus took it back. His name, his rank, his honor, returned to him like it had ever been in question. But just as it seemed like things were shifting in the right direction, another voice rang out from the crowd. "That's him. That's the guy who tried to break into my store." Every head turned. A man in a store uniform was standing at the edge of the sidewalk, breathless, pointing at Marcus. For a second, time stopped. Marcus felt his stomach drop, but his face remained unreadable. The crowd murmured. Some people exchanged uneasy glances. Others raised their phones higher, sensing that things had just taken another turn. Rachel stepped forward immediately. "Excuse me." Her voice was sharp, controlled. "What did you just say?" The store owner, middle-aged, flustered, pointed again, this time more aggressively. "I saw him. Earlier tonight, outside my shop. He was trying to get in." Marcus didn't blink. He didn't flinch. Because he knew with absolute certainty that this was a lie. But the first officer, sensing an opportunity, a way to reclaim his authority, latched onto it immediately. Well, he muttered. "Looks like we might have a real reason to bring you in after all." And just like that, the situation that had been on the verge of de-escalation had taken a sharp and dangerous turn. The air around them felt charged, the tension stretching so tight it might snap at any moment. The first officer, emboldened by the store owner's sudden accusation, stepped closer to Marcus, his confidence returning. "Well, Captain," he said, his voice laced with something between triumph and arrogance, "looks like we've got some unfinished business." Rachel wasn't having it. "You've got to be kidding me," she snapped, stepping between Marcus and the officer. "This is ridiculous, and you know it." Marcus didn't say anything to him. He didn't need to. The truth had been laid out for everyone to see. Rachel finally let out a breath. "Come on," she said, nudging Marcus toward his car. "You've had enough of this nonsense for one night." Marcus nodded, walking toward the driver's side. As he reached for the door, he glanced back one last time. The store owner was still standing there, his face a mix of guilt and embarrassment. The first officer looked stiff, arms crossed, as if trying to convince himself he had done nothing wrong. The commanding officer was speaking quietly to him now, his expression hard. Marcus knew nothing would erase what had just happened, but as he slid into the driver's seat, he also knew something else. People had seen, people had watched. And this time, the truth hadn't been buried. The commanding officer turned to the store owner, his face unreadable. "You're saying you saw this man." He motioned toward Marcus. "Outside your store tonight." The store owner hesitated for just a second, so quick most people wouldn't have noticed. But Marcus did, so did Rachel. "That's right," the man said, nodding too fast. He was lurking around, looked like he was trying to break in. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Where's your security footage?" The man blinked, his mouth opened, then closed. Rachel folded her arms. "Yeah, I'd love to see that footage too." The first officer stiffened, realizing the situation was slipping out of his hands again. "We can sort that out at the station," he said quickly. "For now, I think it's best way." Or, the commanding officer interrupted, his voice cutting through the chaos, "We can check right now." He turned to the store owner. "You do have cameras, don't you?" The man swallowed. Yeah, of course, Pat." "Great," Rachel said, her tone sharp. "Let's take a look." The store owner hesitated again, but with the entire crowd watching, he had no choice. He pulled out his phone, tapping through an app before holding up the screen. And there it was. The footage showed a man outside the store, pacing near the door. He had a hood up, his hands tucked into his pockets. But when he turned slightly, the screen froze on his face. It wasn't Marcus. Not even close. The crowd murmured. A few people gasped. The store owner's face drained of color. The first officer's jaw clenched. Marcus didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The evidence spoke for itself. Rachel let out a slow breath. "Well, would you look at that," she said. "Doesn't even resemble Captain Williams." The commanding officer turned to the first cop, his expression stone cold. "You were about to arrest a highly decorated Navy captain over nothing," he said, his voice measured but sharp. "You profiled him, detained him, and now, when given a chance to correct yourself, you still pushed forward." The first officer shifted uncomfortably, his hands balled into fists. But before he could say anything, the commanding officer turned to Marcus. "Captain Williams, I sincerely apologize for this disgraceful incident." Marcus met his gaze, his face unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. But just as the situation seemed to settle, Marcus turned toward the store owner. "Why did you lie?" His voice was calm but direct. The man looked down, shifting on his feet. I made a mistake." But Marcus knew better. This wasn't just a mistake. It was something else. And as he watched the man fidget, eyes darting toward the first officer, a new realization settled in. This wasn't random. And they both knew it. The street was still buzzing with murmurs, the weight of what had just happened hanging in the air. The store owner avoided Marcus's gaze, his fingers fidgeting at his sides. He had been caught, exposed in front of an entire crowd, and now there was nowhere left to hide. The commanding officer took a step toward him. "You falsely accuse this man," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Why?" The store owner swallowed hard. I thought it was him. It was dark. I was nervous." Marcus stared at him, his expression unreadable. He had heard these excuses before. He knew exactly what they meant. Rachel, still standing beside him, shook her head. "That wasn't a mistake," she said, her voice sharp. "That was a choice." The first officer shifted uncomfortably. His confidence was gone now, replaced by something that almost looked like regret, but not quite. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was sorry he got caught. The commanding officer sighed heavily before turning back to Marcus. "Captain Williams, I'll be filing a report on this incident personally. This is not how we operate, and it won't be ignored." Marcus nodded, slipping his ID back into his pocket. He wasn't sure if he believed him, but he also knew this wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it wouldn't be the last. He exhaled slowly, looking around. The crowd was still there, some people shaking their heads, others quietly talking amongst themselves. A few approached Marcus, offering words of support, small gestures of solidarity. He appreciated it, but it didn't change what had just happened. Rachel gave him a look, one that said everything they both knew to be true. They had won this time, but it wasn't really a victory. The first officer turned to his commanding officer, his voice low. "Sir, I..." But the older man held up a hand. "We'll talk later." His tone left no room for argument. The first officer gave one last glance at Marcus before stepping back, jaw tight, frustration clear in his stance. "Here's something that will have you on the edge of your seat. Imagine driving home after a long day, minding your own business, when suddenly, flashing red and blue lights appear in your rearview mirror. Your heart pounds. You know you've done nothing wrong, but something about this stop doesn't feel right." That's exactly what happened to Navy Captain Marcus Williams, a man who has served his country with honor, a leader, a protector, yet on this night, none of that seemed to matter. He wasn't in uniform. He wasn't standing on a Navy ship, commanding respect. He was just another black man behind the wheel. And to the officer who pulled him over, that's all he saw. The moment Marcus rolled down his window, the energy shifted. The officer, stern, impatient, looked him up and down with a cold stare. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation. Marcus complied, keeping his hands in clear sight, just as he'd been taught to do. He wasn't new to this, but something told him that no amount of calm or cooperation would change what was about to happen. Then came the questions, ones that had nothing to do with any traffic violation. "Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Is this your car?" The tone wasn't curiosity, it was something else. Suspicion. Disrespect. Marcus answered each question, keeping his voice even. But when he handed over his ID, something shifted in the officer's expression. He saw the name, the military designation. The realization flickered across his face, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus hesitated. "Sir, may I ask why?" "Step out, now." His heart pounded, but he kept his composure. Slowly, carefully, he unbuckled his seatbelt and got out. The officer moved closer, invading his space. Then, with no explanation, he ordered Marcus to turn around and place his hands on the car. This was beyond routine. It was humiliation. A public spectacle. People driving by slowed down watching. The air was thick with tension. But here's the thing, what happened next changed everything. Because while that officer thought he had all the power in this situation, he had no idea who he had just messed with. And trust me, you do not want to miss what happened next. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The officer's hand hovered near his holster, his stance rigid with authority. This wasn't about a broken taillight or speeding. This was something else entirely. Marcus had spent decades in the Navy, had trained soldiers, commanded missions, and handled high-pressure situations most people couldn't even imagine. But right now, standing on the side of the road under the harsh glow of streetlights, he was being treated like a criminal, like he didn't belong, like his service, his sacrifice, his rank, none of it mattered. The officer began patting him down, moving with a force that wasn't necessary. Marcus clenched his jaw, staying still. He knew better than to react. He'd seen situations like this escalate too quickly, too easily. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, breathing steadily. A small crowd was gathering at a distance, drivers who had slowed down, pedestrians watching from the sidewalk. Their faces were a mix of curiosity and concern. Some had their phones out, recording. "Sir, what exactly am I being stopped for?" Marcus asked, his voice even but firm. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at Marcus' ID again. His lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time, something close to hesitation flashed in his eyes. "You fit the description," he finally said. Marcus exhaled slowly. He'd heard that phrase before. It was vague, convenient, dangerous. The officer turned back toward his squad car, still holding Marcus's ID. He said nothing, just left him standing there, hands still resting on the car. The silence stretched on. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, steady but strong. His mind raced, not with fear, but with calculation. He needed to stay in control, to keep the situation from spiraling. Minutes passed. The officer was speaking into his radio now, glancing back at Marcus occasionally. Then, another patrol car pulled up. A second officer stepped out, younger, with a different energy. He walked toward Marcus, his gaze flicking between him and the first officer. "What's going on here?" he asked. The first officer hesitated, then handed over Marcus's ID. The younger cop's eyes widened slightly as he read it. Then he looked at Marcus, really looked at him, for the first time. "Captain Williams?" His voice carried something the first officers hadn't. Recognition, respect. Marcus nodded. "That's right." The younger cop's posture shifted. He turned to his colleague, lowering his voice. The two officers exchanged hushed words. The tension in the air didn't disappear, but it changed.